No parents. No home. No Izuku. Ochako sat on the steps of the interior entrance of her parents' apartment, her face buried in her knees trying to hold in the tears trying desperately to fall as her chest rapidly took in air. She couldn't fall apart now she had a job to do still in her casual clothes with Izuku's mask around her neck, though now she had grabbed her pink gauntlets before leaving the apartment, she walked outside and grappled away. She still had to find Momo. Ochako scanned the streets as she flew towards Momo's apartment. The streets were cracked, cars with their doors pulled off, windows busted, and smoke rising from anything that had crashed due to the onslaught of Nomu ravishing the city. Ochako felt the heavy weight of guilt rise in her chest. The Nomu were looking for them, and they had left. The Nomu went building after building, hurting and throwing person after person trying to identify their faces. Ochako looked up at the oncoming building, squinting at the floor Momo and the rest had been living in. There was a gaping hole in the glass wall. Oshako's eyes grew worried. No, not Momo too. Ochako flew through the hole in the glass, landing in the familiar white apartment. Tables had been turned over, dust and soot tainted the walls and furniture. Nomu, covered in debris, rummaged through the place. Ochako. A voice called as the front door to the apartment opened. Ochako turned as Momo, battered and bruised, walked through the door. Momo, are you okay? Ochako asked, rushing to her creation friend. Momo nodded sadly. A Nomu broke while I was unconscious, but a hero that thankfully hadn't left duty saved me. I'm fully awake now, but I saw a lot of what happened. The Nomu, they broke through the hospital debris. They got loose. Some were beaten, but most had gotten away. They're roaming out in Hokkaido now, and that's not all. I got word from the school. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. Ochako and Momo flew back up the mountain, landing in front of the wrecked cabin. Momo looked around at the remains. Quote dot. It looks like it was a nice place to live. Momo said, giving a small smile. However, Oshako's eyes remained dull and lifeless. Thanks, she said simply as she walked through the front door first. The moment she stepped through the door, a little girl ran her way towards her, jumping into Oshako's arms. Coco, you're okay, Eri said, as she snuggled into Oshako's chest. Ochako smiled softly, holding the girl up with one arm and rubbing her head with the other. Yes. Yes, I am, and so are you. I'm glad you're safe, Ochako said, though her lips started to tremble. She brought the girl into a hug, still holding her. Coco, what's wrong? Where's Deku? He beat the bad guy, right? He always beats the bad guy, Eri said confidently as she continued to be squashed by Oshako's grip. Ochako looked up from her hug slightly to look at Kirishima, who was sitting on the couch. His eyes grew slightly wider as he turned away. No one told Eri. Here, Eri. The grown-ups have to talk right now. Can you watch over Hima in your room, please? Ochako asked, forcing herself to keep it together and putting Eri down. Eri gave a worried look, but nodded as she walked upstairs. The evening sunlight shone through the large hole in the living room wall, and through the smaller holes in the roof. Ochako stared at her injured friends. Todoroki still lay unconscious alongside Mina on the torn and burned couch. Ochako looked around her home. Once again, no Izuku. The familiar couch, the kitchen, even the surrounding forest. All destroyed. Ochako felt her chest starting to rise and fall faster as she stood. Her vision was getting blurry, her body shaking. She inhaled, trying to keep it all in. Desperately, anything to keep from letting it out, clenching her fist as hard as she could. Shoto. She heard Momo whisper as the rich girl walked over to her boyfriend's side, sitting next to him and stroking his hair sadly. Kirishima, giving into his grief, sat next to the unconscious Mina, doing nothing but staring at her. Ochako watched as the couples grieved together, while the person she usually grieved with was nowhere to be seen. Ochako ran up the stairs. Oi, Urara! Kirishima started to call out, but Momo raised her hand, shaking her head, signifying Kirishima to leave the brunette be. Ochako ran into the room, slamming the door shut as she pressed her back against the door, slowly sliding down it as her chest was now rapidly rising and falling. Gasping for breath, Ochako gripped her arms, squeezing her eyes shut before the floodgates opened. Waterfalls of tears came rushing down Oshako's face. She screamed as everything flowed out, losing her parents to custody, losing her school, her home, and worst of all, losing the one she loved. All coming out at once, the energy to keep it held back crumbling after just a few hours. It was too much. The sunset was growing ever more orange, rays of orange sunlight passing through the mountains, and making its way through the gigantic missing hole in the wall and roof of the room Izuku had burst out of, shining into the room. The warm rays of sun slowly began to shine over Ochako and the door as she screamed. However, even with the warm rays of sun cutting through the cold air, Ochako could feel nothing but the internal frost of loss. Back downstairs, the warm sunset light shone through the larger gaping hole in the wall Yosuke had kicked down. Momo and Kirishima, both holding their injured loved ones, stared out into the mountains and sunset light, slowly being encased in light as well. I would call this beautiful if circumstances were different, Momo said sadly. Kirishima nodded in agreement as they stared out into the sunset, listening to the screams and wails of a lost soul from just up the staircase. What happened out there? Kirishima asked. Momo slowly shook her head. Everything. The no Omu broke free and just everything. Ochako briefly mentioned in passing that her parents were taken into custody. Odi. Momo said. Kirishima's eyes grew wide with anger. But they were tricked. We wouldn't know anything we do now if it weren't for them, Kirishima said. However, Momo continued to look out through the missing wall. How do we prove that? We aren't in the best position ourselves. Unless Ua can do something. We'll be taken into custody eventually as well. Then, we just have to do something about it. A weak voice said below them. Momo and Kirishima looked down in surprise to see Todoroki barely hanging onto consciousness, trying to push himself up. We can't just sit here. You know what Aizawa said, a female voice said. Kirishima felt a hand on his cheek. He looked down to see Mina, with a tear running down her cheek. We'll save everyone, even as vigilantes if we have to. How are you guys awake with those injuries? You need to rest, Kirishima said. However, Mina did nothing but smile. You really think we can sleep with our friend crying alone up there? Mina said weakly. Kirishima couldn't help but smile down at her. Todoroki had managed to sit his way up, and was now staring out the same view as the others. Guys, I told Ochako this already. But the school and the city back home. They were overrun with Nomu as well. The students, while fear and worry of their friends grew in their hearts, did not react. If anything, that wasn't too surprising after today. Aizawa, Present Mike and Vlad King were all severely injured along with a lot of the school's students. Looks like the Nomu themselves attack each hero school and the cities around them. The hero schools were pretty much the last line of defense behind the rich agencies such as the Endeavor Agency. That's gonna limit our numbers even more. And I doubt society is going to have faith in heroes anymore. In the public eye, entrusting their fate into the hands of hero trainees in high school. The people will try to defend themselves. Not to mention the government will have a lot to say on what happened with today's events. Kirishima thought out loud. Well, Todoroki said, stretching his neck a bit. I'm not worried about what the government says. Or what the schools say. I follow the right thing to do. Midoriya wouldn't sit by and just let the government take over. He wouldn't sit down and watch things collapse around him. And if one of us were captured, he wouldn't sit around and wait for someone else to save us. Mina's right. We signed up for this. Pro-heroes. Or vigilantes. We'll save people, and stop the villains. Kirishima said. Isn't that right, Bakugo? Kirishima remained staring out the gaping hole, however Todoroki and Momo looked behind them, Mina stretching her neck to see even while she continued laying down. There Bakugo stood at the bottom of the stairs, the orange light of the sun slowly encasing him, bringing him out of the shadows, leaning against a wall with his arms crossed. Bakugo looked away from them, now also staring out into the mountains. I've got a debt to repay, he mumbled, to that nerd for Kamino. And round face. Todoroki, Mina, and Momo all grew wide-eyed at Bakugo's surprisingly honest and calm response. Then it's settled, Momo said, turning back to the sunset, now an even deeper shade of orange. We'll go back to Ua and inform Aizawa and the others about what's going on after that. Looks like it's the life of vigilantes for us. The house had grown quiet, Oshako's crying coming to a close. Everyone downstairs sat in silence as they looked out towards the mountains. From upstairs, Ochako had moved away from the door, now sitting on the edge of the hole in the wall, her feet dangling from the wall. Her eyes red and puffy, tear stains running down her cheek, she stared into the same sunset. Quietly, Eri creaked into the room, Hima creaking right in after her. They both silently made their way across the room until they too sat next to Ochako, staring out into the sunset. Deku's gone, isn't he? Eri said sadly. Ochako didn't look at the little girl but continued to stare out into the sunset. Yay, he is, Ochako said. She took a deep breath. But he won't be gone long. He'll come back, if I don't save him first. Eri and Hima sadly smiled as the group of three continued to stare out into the sunset. Asterisk 105 hours remain asterisk. Dot 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 dot.